This is America, where Donald Trump is waging war on illegal narcotics. He's gone as far as labelling fentanyl a weapon of mass destruction. So is his strategy of threatening drug traffickers with everything from the death penalty to military strikes effective? We'll have more on that later, but first, over to Rob Matheson in our Washington, D.C. studio.
Thanks, Bernard. Now, the Trump administration has declared a war on drugs in the U.S. So has almost every other administration since Richard Nixon in 1971. Now, like previous efforts, this latest version does have varying degrees of success. According to the Centers for Disease Control, alcohol accounts for almost double the number of deaths related to opioids. But the administration has decided to focus on the painkiller fentanyl. It regards it as a significant threat to the U.S.
Our country is being poisoned from within by the drugs and by all of the other crime that's taking place. This historic executive order I will sign today, we're formally classifying fentanyl as a weapon of mass destruction, which is what it is. No bomb does what this is doing. The cartels are waging war on America, and it's time for America to wage war on the cartels. We'll also impose the death penalty on major drug dealers and traffickers. Executed the largest fentanyl bust in the history of the U.S. Drugs entering our country by sea are down 97%, and we're not going to let people kill 300,000 people a year with drugs.
Well, Donald Trump has been using the flow of fentanyl as a reason to hit countries with tariffs, and dramatic videos shown military strikes targeting boats suspected of carrying drugs to the U.S., although no evidence has been made public to back that up. Now, at the same time, the agency, which is focused on dealing with addiction and treatment, is one of several facing budget cuts. Patty Culhane explains from Washington, D.C.
From the first days of his administration, fentanyl has been a key focus for U.S. President Donald Trump, using it as a reason to impose tariffs.
They're sending massive amounts of fentanyl, killing hundreds of thousands of people a year with the fentanyl.
A key priority highlighted in major speeches.
But we need Mexico and Canada to do much more than they've done, and they have to stop the fentanyl and drugs pouring into the USA. They're going to stop it.
Increasing criminal penalties for traffickers of fentanyl, even declaring it a weapon of mass destruction. Using it as a premise to launch unprecedented military strikes on boats in the Caribbean Sea and the Pacific Ocean, which have killed more than 200 people. Democrats have questioned if that is legal.
But I'm saying how odd it is, especially since the administration always announced this is against narco traffickers. We've attacked narco traffickers. How odd it is that the presence of narcotics on a boat is not one of the targeting criteria.
Statistics show fewer people are dying on American streets because of fentanyl overdoses. In 2020, there are around 56,000 people who died. It peaked during the COVID pandemic, almost 74,000. But estimates show for 2025 that number's going to fall to around 44,000 people who overdosed on fentanyl. At the same time, cuts to the federal budget have hit the government agency responsible for drug policy hard. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration has lost around half of its staff, and one study put the number of grants to combat drug abuse at $1.74 billion in the first 6 months of Trump's second term. The president also signed an executive order banning federal funds from being used to buy Narcan, an over-the-counter medication that reverses overdoses. Many presidents have launched a war on drugs, but none quite like this. Patty Culhane, Al Jazeera, Washington.
I want to take a closer look at some of the numbers that Patty has been talking about. We put together a chart, and it shows the number of deaths related to drug overdoses for the past 20 years. From 2004 till 2014, it was pretty low for fentanyl. Now, that changed dramatically over the following 10 years. It rose from 5,000 to that massive peak you can see there of about 74,000 in 2022. Deaths decreased to about 47,000 in 2024, but they still remain above levels from before the pandemic. Now, even when you break it down by demographics, most groups still had higher rates in 2024 than in 2019. Statistically, there's no question that fentanyl is at the center of opioid addiction in the US. In previous years, it's accounted for many more deaths annually than any other drug, excluding alcohol. But it started as a regular painkiller, often prescribed by doctors. Bernard Smith breaks down what fentanyl actually is.
Fentanyl began as a prescription medicine, a synthetic opioid for treating severe pain after surgery. But it's 50 to 100 times stronger than morphine. Drugs gangs press fentanyl into pills designed to look like legitimate drugs, or mix it with cocaine, methamphetamine and heroin. 2 milligrams of fentanyl can be fatal. Users often have no idea they're taking it. In the brain, fentanyl floods opioid receptors. That triggers a surge of dopamine, a rush of euphoria and pain relief. But at the same time, it attacks part of the brain that controls breathing. When overdosed, breathing slows, then stops. Now, in some parts of the US, these vending machines give out test strips that allow users to see if there's fentanyl in whatever they're taking. But the federal government has stopped funding for the strips, as well as for an over-the-counter medication that reverses overdoses. And this machine is rapidly running out of stock. The administration says providing such services facilitates illegal drug use.
With the signing of the HALT Fentanyl Act,
the Trump administration claims that designating fentanyl a weapon of mass destruction and using the military and intelligence organizations to fight drug smuggling and production led to a 14% drop in overdose deaths in 2025 to 70,000. But according to research from the journal Science, fentanyl started becoming less available in 2023. That's when the Biden administration put pressure on China to take action against manufacturers of fentanyl precursor chemicals. And there's anyway no shortage of other drugs to fill the gap. There are now more deaths in the US from methamphetamines. Bernard Smith, Al Jazeera.
Well, I want to introduce our guest. Sanho is Director of the Drug Policy Project at the Institute for Policy Studies. Thank you for being with us. And John Feehery is Republican political strategist. Thank you both, gentlemen, for joining us on Al Jazeera. Sanho, I want to start with you. So-called war on drugs started back around about 1971 with Richard Nixon. It got a boost under Ronald Reagan. It also got a big boost again with Bill Clinton. What's different this time?
This time it's on steroids. So we've always had this very tough policy. We spent more than $1 trillion fighting this war on drugs in my lifetime, probably closer to $2 trillion at this point, and the drugs are winning. And the problem is that what the drug war does is it gives essentially a price support for drug traffickers. When we're talking about fentanyl, marijuana, heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, these are essentially minimally processed agricultural and chemical commodities that cost pennies per dose to manufacture. There's nothing exotic about these substances. They're not difficult to produce, but they are illegal. And so by making it illegal and increasing risks to traffickers, it allows them to charge an ever higher risk premium to the next person down that smuggling chain. So as long as the end user is willing to pay the street price, people are more than willing to supply these drugs. What's counterintuitive about this is that the more you crack down on this problem, the higher the chances someone will get caught, the longer the prison sentence they may have to serve, then the more money they can charge the next person. So there are two demographics that never want this war to end. One are drug traffickers and the other are drug warriors, because it's a symbiotic relationship. Neither can make a reasonable living without the other, because then you're just talking about cheap products. I
want to dig more deeply into that. But John, just to get a sense of perspective on this, or a sense of context, we were mentioning before, Centers for Disease Control, the number of people who die from alcohol each year outweighs the number of people who die from opioid-related deaths. Why isn't the administration, and I know I'm oversimplifying this, focusing on alcohol as a priority over opioids?
Well, we already fought that battle with prohibition, and the alcohol guys won. And obviously, people like to drink, and it's been part of our culture for many, many years. I think the thing that's really really hit America over the last 20 years has been the hollowing out of the middle of America with the heroin epidemic that really came from other opioids. And that was a huge fight that really hurt America very much. And then over the last 5 to 10 years, the spread of these other drugs, the fentanyl, that's been in part, trafficked really to many school children. So it was once a purview of the inner city of these drug wars, but now it's really hit a lot of suburban America. And so you had the president, I think rightly, from a political perspective, say, we can't have this. We can't have these drugs flow into high schools and kids, taking what they thought were other types of drugs and then dying almost immediately from overdoses of fentanyl. And so politically, it's been effective for Trump. It's really kind of mobilized his political base, and they appreciate him taking effective action, even though it might not be as effective as he thinks. People like strength, and he's taken strength to the drug traffickers.
Some of that response that we've seen, and you touched on it earlier, was a kind of a more militaristic approach that this administration has been taking towards this. We can see some of the pictures in the wall there, the impacts of that on the boats that have been traveling ostensibly to the US, ostensibly carrying drugs, although as yet, as far as I'm aware, there's no proof that's been given that that is the case. It's been classified as a weapon of mass destruction. That's why we see pictures like this. Sanho, do you think that description accurately reflects the scale of the problem in the U.S.?
No, and in fact, there's a sleight of hand going on. So you mentioned alcohol earlier. I think there's a far deadlier drug we should talk about, which is tobacco. So according to the Trump administration's own Centers for Disease Control, they estimate about 450,000 Americans will die every year from tobacco-related injuries and illnesses. That's about 6 times as many that are dying from fentanyl. And yet we're not seeing drone strikes on the homes and headquarters of tobacco executives in Virginia or North Carolina. We're not seeing any of that. Why do they get a complete pass when they're killing so many more people, 6 times more people than fentanyl?
I want to take the opportunity just to break down the kind of levels of substance abuse that there is in America. Tens of millions of people do suffer from drug and alcohol addiction in the U.S. According to the latest figures, more than 48 million Americans struggle with alcohol or drug abuse. That's nearly 16.8% of the population. Of that number, just under 28 million reported having an alcohol use disorder, while just over 28 million people are said to have a disorder connected with using drugs. That means that some 6 million Americans say that they suffer from both. John, wouldn't it be easier, do you think, over a longer-term policy to try to deal with some of the causes that would drive people to use these drugs on a regular basis, rather than dealing solely with the symptoms?
Well, I mean, there is this whole idea of a mental health epidemic that needs to be addressed, and how do you address it in an easy way? It's pretty hard to do that because you're talking about the life stories of millions of different people that are completely different. You do have lots of treatment out there. There's a lot of treatment options. What happens, though, especially with opioids that become heroin addiction, people started these opioids because they had a bad back. And they were totally legal, and then all of a sudden they overdosed or became addicted to those opioids, and then all of a sudden they're going to heroin because they couldn't get the opioids any longer. So I think that's part of this situation that's really kind of the Trump administration is dealing with. Also, the American people don't really have patience or time to deal with the far-flung mental health issues, and so they like the dramatic gestures that the president is taking. And what the president is taking when he takes these dramatic measures, he's saying to people, I care about you, and I'm going to be strong, and you can exhibit strength to maybe stop the bad guys. And it's also externally facing. He thinks that there's an invasion from outside the country, and he can stop this invasion through a strong, effective. I'm not saying that all the facts are with him. I'm saying that from a dramatic narrative, the president is really good at capturing the narrative, and politically it's actually worked for him, especially with the Republican base.
Sanho, let's talk about that, because it is very much about the narrative, isn't it? If I understand it correctly, about the majority of drugs that come into the United States come across borders, and particularly across the southern border, and yet the impact that we're seeing is on these very dramatic pictures of these boats being hit as ostensibly they head towards the US. To what extent is this having any impact at all? What we're seeing in terms of those pictures, is it having any impact on the flow of drugs into the US?
Absolutely minimal. This is mostly drug war theaters, what you're seeing in these boat strikes. There are so many different ways drugs enter the country that we could do a whole hour on this, right? So whether they're using submarines or semi-submersibles or ultralights or drones or drug tunnels or there's a myriad ways they can move drugs into the United States besides these boats. Just last week, they uncovered a tunnel on the U.S.-Mexico border in Tijuana. They found 1 ton of cocaine there. But once these tunnels are open, and we found more than 300 since the 1990s, each of these tunnels, if they're open for a few months or even a few years, they can move tons of drugs every week, 24/7. And they can repatriate cash and guns and ammunition back south. So there are far greater threats in terms of drug smuggling, but this is what they chose, because I think one reason Trump likes this policy is that it gives him these supernatural powers almost. It's like he gets to play the role of the angry God of the Old Testament, to look down from the heavens and literally smite anyone who displeases you without legal consequence. So we're talking about more than 200 extrajudicial killings, murders. There's no trial, no evidence. This is completely problematic. It's quite illegal. And yet it's happening on a regular basis, and we're not seeing significant opposition.
Johnny, the president has also used this as an opportunity to bring in tariffs against China and Mexico and so on. If this was an issue that only existed within the U.S., that is to say that the manufacturing took part in the U.S. and the consumption took part in the U.S., do you think that as much attention would be paid to it? Is he using this essentially as an excuse in order to be able to put punitive measures on other countries?
Well, definitely with the Chinese, it's definitely become a bargaining chip. But it's also, there is some evidence that a lot of these precursors are started in China and then are produced in Mexico. So yeah, of course, but many of these drugs do come in from overseas. They are used by drug gangs. They are something that addict millions of Americans. And then when the president does these extrajudicial killings, which I'm fascinated by because they're clearly illegal. But there's very little political pushback by any Republican that I could see. And the reason is because their constituents like it. And they like it because they're saying that these drugs are bad. We're sending a message to our children that they're so bad, we're going to kill people for bringing them in. And I do think that has an impact on the psyche of whether these drugs are something that you should easily use or not. And it's a dramatic difference from the Obama administration. The Obama administration was very, let's stop this war on drugs. Let's have more treatment. Let's not even think about them as being bad. Trump has taken a totally different direction, which is these are bad. We're going to kill people for them, and we're going to send a message that you shouldn't be taking them. And I think it's very interesting that there's not a lot of political pushback from anybody.
Sanho.
I think the fentanyl excuse is a convenient one for this administration to exercise all kinds of other powers. It has been, in many ways, the lies they've told around fentanyl have been kind of the skeleton key that unlocks all these other powers. So one of the first things he did when Trump came into office was declare a trade war with Mexico and Canada on the basis that Canada was somehow smuggling fentanyl to the United States. Canada it's negligible, if at all. And yet that allowed him to unilaterally impose these tariffs. And over the course of the following year, he normalized that behavior so that he was waving tariffs around at anyone who even looked at him the wrong way. And yet the Supreme Court finally struck that down, saying this was unconstitutional. But it allowed him to then unlock other powers so that he was able to move the aircraft carrier into the Caribbean. Is able then to attack and invade and kidnap, abduct the head of state of Venezuela, seize the oil in Venezuela, use that oil to strangle Cuba. All of this could not have been done without the lies about fentanyl originally, right? This is so it goes back. This is a very powerful tool that he's unlocked.
Yeah, I think it's a good opportunity to also just break down for people watching just the way that that drugs are ostensibly coming into the country. The U.S. has actively targeted, as we were saying, Canada, Mexico, and China over the trafficking of precursor chemicals used in the manufacturing of fentanyl. Now, in recent years, they've been hit by economic measures, as we were talking about, and that's aimed at halting the supply chain. We're going to broaden it out. We're going to show where most of the fentanyl seizures take place. The vast majority, that's more than 90%, happen at the southwest border points of entry, as we were discussing. According to Customs and Border Protection, they're typically concealed within legitimate cargo, or they're hidden inside passenger vehicles, and most of the time in cars driven by U.S. citizens. The remaining 10% or so comes from the northern border, coastal interceptions or airport mail. Sanho, in terms of the policy that the administration is attempting to put in at the moment, it appears to me that it is trying to shift the responsibility for dealing with the problem from the administration or from the agencies to a more localized community-based structure. But is that possible? Is that feasible? Because at the same time, it appears to be reducing funding for the very facilities that these community-based organizations would be using.
Yes, we know what works in this country. Harm reduction works. It saves lives. But it runs counter to the dogma of this administration. And so when they cut off funding and they restrict funding for fentanyl test strips and for naloxone, people will die as a direct result of that. And it's as if they're saying that the wages of sin ought to be death. And I think that should never be the case. Harm reduction doesn't mean everyone stops using drugs immediately, but it means we keep them alive to the point when they're ready to give up drugs. They haven't overdosed, contracted some incurable disease or anything else, or caused more damage to themselves or to their community. So we try to minimize all those things. And eventually people do recover from this. Many people do. And so we're not funding that. We're deliberately slighting it.
John, do you think there's a misunderstanding in that case in the administration of what recovery from an addiction actually means? Because from what I understand, it appears to be a gradual process that is combined, weaning off, for want of a better phrase, of a particular addiction in coordination with other treatment and so on. And yet this seems to be essentially taking away the tools that people would use in order to be able to make that happen and expecting them just to come to a dead stop.
Yeah, you know, when I was working in Congress, I worked for a guy named Denny Hastert, who was Speaker of the House, and he had a big fight with Bill Clinton over taking away needle exchange programs in D.C. The idea being that if you made people get clean needles, they would be safer when they were taking their drugs. You know, I think what the Hastert was against that, and President Trump is against the idea of this permissive idea of allowing people to safely take drugs, which only leads to more drugs being taken. If you look at what's gone on in San Francisco or California in general, where, you know, the widespread areas where there's widespread needle sharing, but also all these programs, and really very little drug interdiction or being a hard ass and fighting against drugs. And I think that I agree with you. I think that there's probably a better approach to save lives, and I think we need a better way to get treatment out there. But this idea of being tough on drug traffickers and drug users and tough love as a part of the process is part of Republican ideology. And the idea of having its permissiveness that allows widespread getting away with doing drugs is something that Republicans don't really like very much.
Yeah, Sanho, I mean, let's come back to one of the original elements of this, which was the prescription of fentanyl in the early days by doctors. Doctors would seem to be doing this on a very regular basis. Has there been any sort of change in terms of the regulation that doctors and medics face now when it comes to the way in which they prescribe drugs?
There's certainly more scrutiny, but fentanyl has always been used in the medical profession, and it's used very widely today still. I had a colonoscopy the other year, 2 years ago, and they gave me fentanyl as part of the anesthesia. I've had surgery before where they told me I had fentanyl as part of the surgery. These things surprised me, but you know, these are things the fentanyl is used quite often. When my mother was terminally ill with cancer, they gave her home dispensable fentanyl drops. So yeah, it's a widely used drug.
There was one element of this, John, that I wanted to try to understand. One of the key elements appears to be that they're going to shift the emphasis on treatment and support to places of worship as well. Now, why do you think the administration feels that would be an appropriate place to do that?
Well, this goes back to Alcoholics Anonymous and the fact that all those things are faith-based, the idea that faith-based treatment programs work better than non-faith-based. And then also this administration is, when it comes to anything faith-based, they are going to embrace it because they have been part of their coalition as Christian conservatives who believe that faith-based programs work better. Same thing with faith-based schools, that they work better. And to your point about opioids, I mean, the drug industry really has been punished and drug companies have been punished for promoting the idea that you can safely take opioids all you want. And this is really what led to kind of the hollowing out of a big portion of America, because the opioids ended up with heroin addiction, and there's plenty of books that have been written about that.
John made a point right at the start of the show that in order to combat alcohol in the US, we had prohibition. That didn't work. And do you think that there's a risk that fentanyl is going to go the same way?
I think there's a real danger in terms of our response to fentanyl that could unleash far worse problems down the road. And we've seen this over and over again. There's something in this field called the iron law of prohibition, that when there's high demand for a substance and you try to clamp down on it, you will end up with more potent, easier to smuggle, easier to manufacture drugs. Similarly to the way that alcohol prohibition transformed the nation of beer drinkers and wine drinkers into a nation of hard liquor drinkers. Right? Because if you were smuggling alcohol during Prohibition, the last thing you wanted to smuggle was beer. It was big and bulky, and you get caught. So you wanted the most compact form available. That's how we ended up with fentanyl. It's cheap to produce. You don't need farmers. You don't need lots of land to grow this stuff. And you can do it in a one-room laboratory. And the chemicals are very cheap. So the knee-jerk response has been, say, okay, let's go after the precursor chemicals that's coming from China. If we stop those chemicals, that's somehow going to stop the fentanyl. And yet the problem is that we are living in an age of AI now, and those precursor chemicals are made from other chemicals. So there's nothing to stop, someone working for a cartel to say, okay, AI, they banned this precursor chemical. What are the components I need to make that myself? You're never going to stop this playing cat and mouse. And more importantly, there are new classes of drugs that are on the horizon we haven't even thought about yet, and AI can unlock that.
Well, we're going to finish that right there, gentlemen, but thank you very much indeed. I want to thank our guest, Director of the Drug Policy Project at the Institute for Policy Studies, Sanho, and Republican political strategist John Feehery. That's all from the team here in Washington. Going to hand you back to Bernard Smith and Al Jazeera's global headquarters in Doha. Don't forget the website, aljazeera.com. Bye for now.
Thanks, Rob. On the next edition of This is America, we'll take a closer look at marijuana policy across the nation. How does the state-by-state legalization approach stack up against the Trump administration's federal policy? That's 18:30 GMT on Tuesday, 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time if you're here in the US. Until then, from the entire team here at This is America, it's bye for now.